Hey guys, today we're going to be talking about, sexuality and consciousness, which I'm really excited about. And, I almost named this podcast, sex and consciousness, or something along those lines, because I think that exploring consciousness is something I'm passionate about. This idea of sort of awakening from not being fully aware and from going from everything that's handed to us, we just kind of accept it, or we're not questioning things, to really realizing like our power as individuals and knowing that we can make conscious choices and create what we want to create for ourselves and in the world and in our sex life. So that's what we're going to get into. Today. Before we get into it, though, a couple things I wanted to mention. So for the last handful of episodes, I have been putting 2 or 3 related episode links in the show notes. So whether you're new or not, if you're kind of like, oh, I really like this episode, I want more like that, go to the show notes and you'll get recommendations that will, be episodes that have a similar vibe. So for this episode, I'm linking back to episode 10, where I talked about the sexual placebo effect and law of attraction. Episode 16, Healing Through Seduction with Pearl Noir, where we incorporate some kind of spiritual concepts and spiritual growth and healing. And then episode 28, where we talked about BDSM, play parties, and queer sexuality with Cassiana Boom, where we get into also a lot of like questioning norms and being conscious and going after what you want and being intentional and all of that. So if you are looking for more amazing episodes, you'll find those there. You can also find them on my website. We'll have all of the links and notes for each episode there. So for this episode number 35, it's going to be heathershannon.co/E35. And it'll be like that for every episode. So again, heathershannon.co/E35, and you will find all of the links that you could ever want. All right. And then for the review of the week, this one says, such a great find. This podcast is fantastic. The host builds such a great rapport with her clients. I think this is about the episode where I coached Vanessa. And I love that we get to hear how these sessions go. It kind of takes the fear out of finding a therapist for the intimate moments in life. Love, love, love this podcast. Thank you very much for the review. And I wanted to use this to point out that, yeah, it's okay to go to sex therapy, right? It's okay to have a sex coach. It doesn't mean something's wrong with you. Basically what it means is you're on this consciousness journey. You're kind of like, wait a second. All of these things that I've been handed about how relationships are supposed to be, how sex is supposed to be, are not factual, are not accurate. I mean, some of it probably is, right? But maybe they're not serving you in terms of what you're wanting to create with your sex life. And you're like, hey, there's got to be another way. And there is. And you know where to find me, right? So instead of looking at it like, oh, there's something wrong with me, look at it like, wow, I am like taking action in my life to create what I want to create and to get the education and information that I deserved back in the day that I didn't get, but now I have access to. So that's why I wanted to share that one. All right, so we're going to start by getting into the Hawkins Scale of Consciousness. So I first came across this actually when I got sick in Puerto Rico last year, and was really having a hard time. And a health coach recommended this book to me after talking to me a little bit. And it's about levels of consciousness and, emotional states and, our perspective. Really, that's how you can think of a level of consciousness is what is your perspective on the world, right? Because you might have 100 people who experience the same thing in a day. And actually the Letting Go book by David Hawkins talks about someone getting in like a fender bender in a parking lot, I think. And he goes through, hey, if you're at this level of consciousness, here's how you react to that. If you're at more of a, medium one or a high one or low one, here's how you're going to react to that. And it's fascinating because I think our human minds can get so stuck, and mine too, right? On, like, oh, I got a new client, or my podcast is doing well today. Today's a good day. Or, I didn't hear back from that client, or, I was trying to network with someone and they missed our meeting. Like, oh, today's not a good day, right? And we can become so conditional on our circumstances. And so what I love about this level of consciousness is that it's something that is at least somewhat in our control, that we can be intentional about and choose to be on a growth path with that. And I just think that's so much more empowering, and it's so much more focused on, what is it that we can control versus our circumstances, which actually only account for about 10% of our happiness. Isn't that fascinating? Except for zero. Like certain circumstances or situations might make it easier to have better feeling thoughts or easier to have a good perspective, but still, they actually only account for 10% of our happiness, which I think is fascinating. So doing this kind of work on your own perspective is going to account for much more. And the other piece is our health, right? And it's interesting that I kind of found this scale of consciousness due to health issues. And, there's just such an interplay between our thoughts and our physical state. So when my physical state was really suffering, it was hard. It was really hard to have good thoughts. It's like I was struggling to eat. I was struggling to breathe well. And then at the same time, I knew I kind of had to improve my thought to help improve my physical state. And so I think that those two pieces together, sort of like, genetics, epigenetics, physical wellness, thoughts, perspective, that's the other 90% of what makes up our happiness. So we're going to get into that. We're going to get into some qualities of self-energy. And then we're going to talk about what does it look like to become more conscious and, kind of embody our own internal higher consciousness when it comes to our intimate lives, right? And I feel like this could be a long episode. So I'm just going to say it now. And then because I do want to also share my own personal experience with, how did I used to approach sex and like what kind of level of consciousness was that at versus how do I look at things now? And hopefully I'll keep evolving, right? I don't think I'm definitely not done evolving. So let's get into the Hawkins Scale of Consciousness. So I'm going to start by just kind of going through this chart, like a map of consciousness. I will share the chart in the show notes, so don't forget that. And we'll kind of go through it somewhat quickly. And so the list is numerical. So when David Hawkins created this, it's a 0 through 1,000 scale. Okay. And so I'm going to let you know the point value. So 0 means like very low vibration. 0 is like dead, like you're not even alive, right? Higher vibration means like you are just vital and vibrant and full of life, really. Okay. So we're going to go through the name of the level, the number associated with it, what is sort of the predominant emotional state, what is sort of your view on life, and any other sort of details that I might add. All right. So the bottom level is shame. So shame is at a level of 20. And I think we all kind of know what shame is. It's kind of like almost feeling embarrassed about our existence. And I want to make one distinction before we go too far in this. There's a difference between experiencing the emotion of shame occasionally versus being like, that's the state that you like live in. And that's your perspective on the world. So as I'm going through these, what I'm saying is this is the perspective on the world. So if you're like, I experience shame sometimes, does that mean I'm at the lowest level? No, you probably experience many of these. What you want to kind of pay attention to is what is your predominant perspective on the world? And be curious about what would it look like if your predominant perspective moved up a level. Okay. So the next level after shame, where you're kind of just embarrassed almost about your existence and just feeling so like you're just awful, is guilt. We can see guilt. You're still not feeling great about yourself. So any level under 200 is you're kind of stuck in this survival, world. That's your perspective. It's like just trying to get by. Most people are under 200, right? I think when this was originally created, David Hawkins said about 85% of people are below 200. But the really interesting thing is, even if you're I think what I had just read was, even if you're at a level of like 300, you're counterbalancing 90,000 people who are like below the 200 level. Isn't that wild? So sometimes we look at the world and we think, oh, well, most people suck, or women suck or men suck, or there's so many terrible things happening in the world. But I find this to be super, super hopeful and empowering, because it's like, if you can just do the work of moving up the scale, you become so magnetic. You become, you're like radiating. That's how I think of it. It's like radiating out this like good energy that benefits everyone that you come into contact with, which is just beautiful, I think. So, okay. So don't get too discouraged while we're going through the lower levels. That was my point with that. Okay. So guilt is the next one. That's at a level of 30, and that's obviously where you just kind of keep thinking like, oh, did I do something wrong? Or did I hurt someone's feelings? Or, there's maybe a little questioning of yourself, or even just assuming like, I am just guilty. I'm wrong. Right. Next level we have is apathy. Apathy is at a level of 50. And so apathy, there tends to be almost like a learned helplessness. Maybe you had tried in the past and you just feel kind of like defeated, and there's sort of a giving up hope, right? So there's just kind of I don't know, like, does anything even matter? And like, what's the point? And things like that. So maybe some despair. Okay, so the next level we're going to look at is grief. That is at a 75 on the 0 through 1,000 scale. So grief is going to be, and again, this is if it's your predominant state. Typically, when I think of grief, I think of, someone died, you lost your job, you realized you had been miserable for years just because you hadn't forgiven yourself. And then you finally forgive yourself. And there's like this grief over all those years that had been lost. So it doesn't mean that that's not healthy, or we don't want to ever feel that. But what it does mean is, if that's your predominant way of being, it's pretty depressing. So I almost think of this level as like depressed. If you're consistently, almost constantly in a state of grief. So there's sort of this tragic feeling along with it. Okay, so then moving up from grief, we have fear. The level of fear is 100. You probably feel pretty anxious. So I actually think of anxious as being fear. A lot of times we think of them as separate. But when we're anxious, we're worried because we like fear that something bad's going to happen typically. Right? And so seeing that connection, I think, can be really helpful too. And so it could be anything. It could be, I'm afraid I'm not going to have money to pay my bills. I'm afraid that people won't like me. I'm afraid that I'm going to say something stupid. I'm afraid of being alone forever. I'm afraid of never having really good sex. So whatever the fear is, again, if you're just having a passing fear, that doesn't mean this is your state of being. But when this is your predominant perspective, this is kind of how most of your day goes, right? And so to just notice that, if that's the case. So as I'm going through these, notice, okay, we've probably all experienced shame, guilt, apathy, grief, fear, right? But where do you tend to live? Where are you like, I probably spend at least 50% of my time there. So notice that. All right. So next we have desire. So this one, I think, they all need caveats, right? So desire, there's a difference between just wanting something, like a goal, like, hey, like, I want to complete a marathon. Cool. Well, that's different than like an addiction or a craving, or just like really jonesing for something. Like, there's this neediness, like, I'm not okay without this thing. There's a sense of scarcity. Like, I have to make sure my needs are met, because a lot of times they aren't, or I'm not going to be okay. So that's more of that desire level. So and desire is 125. That's the level of frequency. Okay. So the next we have anger. And anger, I do think, is kind of a pivotal one, because you go from such a low energy vibration where it's kind of hard to take action. It's a little bit more paralyzing to taking action. So when we think about big movements or changes that have happened politically, right? If we look back to Black Lives Matter, if we look back to, women being able to vote, it's like, first, people had to get pissed off. People had to be like, this is not okay, right? And so again, The important part is we don't want to like live in anger. We don't want to stay there forever, but we can appreciate it as a catalyst, right? And so that's kind of the distinction here too. And you want to notice, do you live in anger? Is it like, this person sucks, this person wronged me, this group of people is awful, I hate these people, where there's sort of this almost like revenge or, aggression, coming from sort of an unhealed place. Again, doesn't mean we don't want to experience anger, but we don't really want to live there permanently, okay? So then the next level, and the last one that's below the 200 level, where we're kind of almost trending downward or trying to like force things to happen in our lives, is so pride is more like, I know what's right and other people don't know what's right. Almost like a little bit of, inflating yourself and looking down on other people a bit. Like I've got it figured out, and if only they knew. It's kind of like self-righteous, really, is how I would look at it. So that's at 175 calibration. And so then we're going to move up to courage. So courage is 200. So courage is the tipping point where we start to then gain more positive momentum moving up the scale of consciousness. And so anything over 200, remember, you're canceling out potentially like thousands of people who are below 200 level. And I think it was like if somebody hit the level of love or enlightenment or something, they're canceling out not canceling out. We're not like canceling people, but, counterbalancing, millions or even 1 billion people. So it's kind of cool. So courage is where you kind of get to a place where it's like, I can do some things. Maybe there's some fear there, but I'm at a level now where like I can face that. I can believe in myself enough to go forward anyways. And so it's empowering. And like once you get to that level, it's like, let's see what could happen, right? Let's see what could happen in your sex life when you get to that level. That might be the level in your sex life where, you're ready to have some difficult conversation, right? And to kind of be like, I don't know how this is going to go, but I know I need to do this for myself. The next level is neutrality. And it's interesting to think that neutrality is actually in the positive range, right? And I think that's fascinating. But it's kind of like lack of resistance a little bit. There's more of a sense of trusting that things will be okay. You're not ecstatic, right? You're not bouncing off the walls, but it's like satisfactory, right? So that's neutrality. Then we have willingness. So willingness is at a level of 310. So at this level, you're balancing out those 90,000 people under 200 just by being willing. I think that's amazing. So willingness, also, if we apply that to sex, what does that mean? Maybe it's like, hey, my partner has been mentioning something for a while. I'm willing to try it, right? There's a sense of optimism. Like, I don't know how this is going to go, but I think we're going to figure it out one way or another. So it doesn't have to be like an unrealistic, naive optimism, but it can kind of be just like a belief that like, we can handle it. Like I'm hopeful, like something good's probably going to happen. And so you're able to be more intentional because you have that willingness to show up. Okay. So then next, we have the level of acceptance. So acceptance is at 350. And with acceptance, again, you maybe have even a higher level of non-resistance. And really, I think the definition of enlightenment is like zero resistance. And so with acceptance, you're not trying to change your partner. You're not really trying to change yourself. And with that, sometimes there might have to be some feeling of feelings like, wow, if I really don't change, or I don't try and change someone else, I have to forgive myself. I have to have compassion for myself. I have to have compassion for this other person. And so there's a level of grace that comes with acceptance. Because you have to keep in mind, even as we're moving up these levels, you're still very human, right? I sometimes used to have the idea that like, I'm just going to be a little Buddha and like, I won't be susceptible to all these like, human failings. No, you still are, even if you're like moving up this level of consciousness. In fact, I heard Eckhart Tolle, my favorite spiritual teacher, give an example of someone who had become enlightened and still smoked cigarettes. And I was like, that's crazy to me, but fascinating. So, yeah. So just realizing though that like it's not going to be perfect, but you might have a little bit more grace, more compassion. All right. So then the next level, and I was a little surprised by this one, is reason. So it's kind of like logic, rationality is a level of 400. And so when I think of this and some of the benefits of this level, when it comes to, intimate relationships, this might look like not taking things too personally, not making decisions from a place of emotional reactivity, but really just being able to look at like, okay, what's here and what can we do with what's here? And so there's like a wisdom. There's a wisdom in that. It's not, I don't think of it, I think this is maybe why this level surprised me. It's not this sort of cold, detached rationality. It's really more of this like understanding and, wisdom and, removing some of that. Like maybe you don't get triggered as much, right? So instead of sort of like, oh, I'm triggered and, things are escalating with my partner and, we're being defensive and whatever. It's just kind of like, okay, this is how you're feeling. Cool. Work with it. All right. So then the next level is love. And I think it's interesting. They don't have love as being the highest on this scale. I also want to mention that you might look at other scales and they might have like different words, but like the gist is the same. So let's keep that in mind. So love is at a level of 500. And I've also heard love defined as appreciation. And I think for those of us who maybe struggle with the word love or like, oh, I don't want to say it, or like, what's it going to mean? Like it can be so loaded sometimes. Like, what if you just looked at it as like a deep appreciation? I think that can really help with that. So anyways, so this level of love, again, keep in mind with both the lower levels and the higher levels, this means this is your predominant like modus operandi. Like this is your perspective on the world in general. And so if you're on a level of love, that means you love everybody, right? That means you love Donald Trump and Joe Biden. That means you love your partner on their good days and their bad days. That means you love yourself when you like quote unquote screw something up, or when you have a great achievement. It's just this idea of like, this is how you exist now. This is who you are. This is how you show up in the world. You are loved. All right. So then the next level we have is joy. And this is 540 on the 0 to 1,000 scale. And so there's this idea of like bliss. I think of joy as being kind of bliss, right? Joy. It's like there's this revelry. There's this and you can kind of tell, like, if you look at that lower level we were at with like grief, apathy, guilt, shame versus joy, you can sense that like increased energy, sort of this like low energy of like, I'm just barely functioning to like, you're vibrating with joy, right? It's like you see and appreciate even more deeply like nature, and maybe you feel, listen to music or dance and feel joy. And maybe you meet new people and you feel joy at connecting. This becomes your predominant state, right? And I also want to be clear, there are not many people at this level. And it's like, if 85% are below 200, now we're up at, 540, not a ton of people that like exist on this level on a day-to-day basis, but it's good to know it's possible, right? And so when I think of Eckhart Tolle, I think he's, somewhere up here in these high ranges. You can tell there's really no resistance. Like he found out he had cancer earlier this year and was like, oh, or last year it was. He felt very present. Like that was his reaction. There was no sort of like, oh, this is bad, or oh, this is going to mean all these difficult things. It was just presence, which is wild to me. So next we have a level of peace. And that is a 600. And it's sort of like, everything is one, everything is perfect. And actually Eckhart Tolle describes this in his Power of Now book. When he had an awakening, there was a sense that like traffic is perfect. People yelling at each other is perfect. And it can be, I think it can be so hard for those of us who are not yet enlightened to conceptualize that, but that's what that level is. And then on this map of consciousness, enlightenment is defined as anywhere between a 700 and a 1000. And that means just pure consciousness, right? It's kind of like being one with source energy. So I hope this is helpful to kind of understand these things. And I also wanted to mention some of the qualities of self-energy. This is sort of another way that we can kind of view our consciousness in general and how we want to approach our intimate relationships. So some of the qualities of self-energy, there's actually the 8 C's of self-energy, according to internal family systems. Oh, and excuse me. So I'm going to read them off to you and then we'll get into them a little bit. So confidence, calmness, creativity, clarity, curiosity, courage, compassion, and connectedness. And so the idea is you don't need someone else to quote unquote make you feel this way. I think that's one of the main issues that we get into in relationships is outsourcing, our confidence, outsourcing feeling connected, even outsourcing, our energy to do things. Like, oh, if someone else was here, if someone else could help me with this, then I could do these things and be courageous, right? But the idea is this is actually who you really are. Your self-energy is your, deeper essence. You could think of it as like spirit, source energy, soul, whatever word kind of resonates with you, your inner divine spark, whatever language you want to use. But what would it also look like to bring these qualities to your sex life? Right? What if you're really curious? What if you didn't really think you had it figured out, but you also still felt confident? What if there was a sense of like playful creativity? What if there was just sort of clarity on like what to do next? Right. And so I think it's really kind of wild because it's not, I think, where we generally exist. But to have this goal of being able to access self-energy more and to have your self-energy running the show, so to speak. So instead of parts that might feel guilty, fearful, apathetic, some of those lower vibrations, sometimes those parts, which I think of the parts as being more of our ego and the self as being more of our higher consciousness. So the more we can kind of work with the parts, work with the ego, rather than trying to banish it or thinking it's bad, the more that the self-energy or higher consciousness can be running the show. So hopefully that makes sense to you guys. So what does it look like to move up the scale of consciousness or to incorporate more self-energy when it comes to sex? So some of the things that I see with people are, people show up with a lot of ego when it comes to sex. It's almost like, ooh, this feels vulnerable. So like, let's bring along a few of my defense mechanisms. And that might look like, bragging about sex. That might look like, oh, well, I have a huge dick, or, I am so good at oral, or like, oh my God, I have the best blowjobs, just you wait. Right. And it's like, what if we don't have to do that? And your partner might like that. And if that's something your partner and you are like into and it's working for you, great. But in general, just notice where it's coming from. So again, you might say the same thing, but if it's coming from a place of insecurity, that's not going to really be serving you. If it's coming from a place of like playfulness or like, hey, I know my partner likes it when I'm just kind of like cocky with sex, that's different, right? So notice where it's coming from, be curious about it. But so that's one thing that I notice with people that tends not to work. There's also then sometimes a shutdown of communication. So with that, instead of embracing courage, it's kind of like, ooh, I have to pretend like I know what I'm doing. I'm supposed to just have this all figured out, right? And so that might be coming from a lower vibration emotion. Whereas when we're embodying self-energy, and we are coming from a place of confidence, we maybe don't have to do that, right? Some of the other things that I see a lot with people are, difficulty really owning their sexuality and being authentic. So whether they're, attracted to people of all genders, or maybe they're attracted to trans people, maybe there's some fear there of like, oh, what if this is, a person that I would want to pursue for a relationship? What will my family think? Right? So there might be the level of fear there. What would it look like if that was the level of acceptance instead of the level of fear? It might look like, hey, this is who I'm attracted to. Cool. That's fun to be attracted, And then there's also with the acceptance, maybe the forgiving yourself. And it's like, okay, I did have some discomfort with this attraction. And what if I can forgive myself for that? And now I'm in a place of acceptance and allowing. Let's see, what other thing? So people might show up with some, erectile dysfunction and feel uncomfortable about that. So oftentimes what's going on with that is actually a really strong desire to please their partner and, to the point that it feels like pressure. So that might, again, be the level of fear where you're experiencing anxiety, right? It's sort of like a performance anxiety type of thing. Let's see. If someone's feeling pride, that might look more of like the cocky approach. If someone's at the level of anger, I don't know that they would be having sex, but they might. That could be like, maybe you just had a big fight and then you like angrily, passionately have sex. But maybe it's almost like you're acting out your anger in the sex. What if that were to look more like courage? That might be getting vulnerable. So instead of like having the angry sex, which, again, if it's working for you, don't worry about it. But if it's not, what would it look like to be courageous? To me, that's getting to what is below the anger. What's that vulnerable part that needs to be acknowledged? And then you have the courage to have that conversation, and then you have more connected sex and you're in more of your self energy feeling connected, right? So that's basically how this works. What are some of the things you can do to move up the scale of consciousness? Listening to the podcast, obviously. I'm going to link to some resources. So I think continuing to educate yourself, maybe, check out the Letting Go book by David Hawkins. Check out some of the internal family systems books. There's a really good one called You're the One You've Been Waiting For by Richard Schwartz. I will link to that in the show notes as well. And I will also share, like, in my own personal life, one of the things that I have mentioned before on the show is that, when I was in a longer term relationship, there was this idea that, I need to make sure we're having sex so that like everything will be okay. And I do actually think that came from some of the lower vibration levels too. So I think there was some fear of like, if we're not having sex enough, that's bad and the relationship's going to fall apart and, I'm going to be alone or whatever. And there was maybe also some pride of like, I don't want it to look bad, that we're not having more regular sex or that I don't have as much of a libido in this relationship right now. So over time, through surrounding myself with sex positive people, which is another thing you can do, through attending workshops, through reading about sexuality, through talking to people that I met along the way, through working on my own attachment style, through getting more comfortable talking about sex and in having a little bit of courage. So I do think that is a pivotal turning point. So it's like, if you can get to courage, it's kind of like you're over the hump in terms of your level of consciousness. And so now I would approach that situation so much differently. I would probably hold space more for the other person. I'd probably be more curious. So bring some of the self energy into the experience through curiosity. I would probably connect with myself more and be more honest with myself about what was really working, I would probably have a conversation with my partner, also in more of a gentle way. So I think there would be more of that level of acceptance, forgiveness. So instead of kind of blaming him for not approaching sex the way I wanted, or wondering if I was, too difficult to please, or, feeling like we had to have this like perfunctory sex, what if I had approached it with more understanding, more compassion for me and him, more hopefulness or just willingness to show up, more love. It doesn't mean like love in the sense of romantic love, but more just like, what if I can love and accept both of us exactly as we are? Right. And so I think that's what it can look like to move up the levels of consciousness. And this was a decade ago for me or more. And so this is not necessarily stuff that, takes place overnight. Like maybe you'll have like a profound spiritual awakening like Eckhart Tolle did. Probably not though. Like 99.9% of us are not going to have that. But we can just become more aware. We can get support. We can kind of do the work. And maybe you have a partner who's willing to do some of that with you, which would be pretty amazing. So your homework, your mission, should you choose to accept it, is to reflect on where are you at currently? Where are you predominantly at on the scale of consciousness? Are you at pride or anger? Are you at desire? Or are you up at, acceptance or reason or willingness? And what does that look like? And I would say, find out what is the level, one level above where you think you're at, and start aiming for that level. So even if you're like, well, shit, I'm down there at shame. Guilt doesn't sound too great. So what? Aim for one level above where you're at. Once you're at guilt, aim for apathy. Then once you're at apathy, aim for grief. Right? Because when we try to jump too many levels, it's almost like a shock to our system. And we don't really yet have the beliefs to support maintaining that level. And so by just going one rung at a time, it's easier for our beliefs to kind of catch up with us. So I hope that's helpful for you guys. Again, I love this topic. So reach out to me if you have any questions about it or just kind of want to discuss it more. And I know this was a little longer than usual, but hopefully it was worth it for you guys.